Today, we will learn about parallel lines. What will we learn about, everyone? Parallel lines, that's right. Parallel lines are two lines that are always the same distance apart and never touch. Let's say that all together. Parallel lines are two lines that are always the same distance apart and never touch. Let's look at some examples and decide whether they are parallel lines or not parallel lines. Let's look at this one first. These are parallel lines because they are always the same distance apart and they never touch. So the distance from one line to the next here is the same as the distance from one line to the next there. And I drew that one a little too long, but you can see that those distances are the same and they never touch. They never come together and touch at a certain point. You should put your thumb up like me because this is an example of parallel lines. Great job putting your thumb up like me to show that these are parallel lines. Let's look at another example. Look here. These lines are not parallel lines because they are not two lines that are always the same distance and never touch. In fact, they are two lines that are not always the same distance and they do touch. So let's look here and see how we can explain that. The distance between the two lines here is different than the distance between the two lines at this point. So they are not always the same distance apart. And the two lines touch right there. So they do touch. They don't never touch. So that doesn't meet our definition of parallel lines. You should put your thumb down like me because this is not an example of parallel lines. These lines are not parallel lines. As I erase the board, let's look at some more examples, and it's going to be your turn to decide whether or not the lines are parallel lines or not. Are these lines parallel? Show me thumbs up if they are parallel lines or thumbs down if they are not parallel lines. I see a lot of you showing me thumbs down that these are not parallel lines. Please turn and talk to your partner to explain why these lines are not parallel. Great job. Denise and Kristen, can you tell me why you said that these lines are not parallel lines? Great. I heard that description before. They are not parallel because they are not always the same distance apart, and they do touch. So they are not parallel lines. Let's look at these lines. Are these lines parallel lines? Thumbs up or thumbs down? I see a lot of thumbs up. These are parallel lines. Turn and talk to a new partner and tell them why these are parallel lines. I heard a lot of good discussion. Everyone was saying that these are parallel lines because they're always the same distance apart and they never touch. Very good. Let's look at one more together. Let's look at these. These are a little tricky. Are these lines parallel? Thumbs up or down? See most of you showing me thumbs down that these lines are not parallel. Turn and tell your partner why these lines are not parallel. Heard some really good discussions. Kiana and Oliver, can you come up to the board, please, and show us why these lines are not parallel? And Kiana and Oliver come up and show us that these lines are not parallel because the distance between the two lines is not always the same. That should have been a little bit more horizontal. And the lines do touch. If we connected or extended this line, the two lines would touch about here. So thank you, Kiana and Oliver, for showing us that example and that explanation. Now I'd like you to please look at the next 3 examples in your workbook and decide if the lines are parallel or not parallel. And remember that parallel lines are, say it with me, 2 lines that are always the same distance apart and never touch. I'll be around to check on your work. Today, we are going to learn about parallel lines. What will we learn about, Zion? Parallel lines. That's right. So parallel lines are 2 lines that are always the same distance apart and never touch. Let's look at these examples. These are parallel lines because they are two lines that are always the same distance apart and never touch. Let me show you what that looks like. So they are two lines that are always the same distance apart. We can see here that at different points on the lines, they're still always the same distance apart. And they never touch. They never come together and cross, and with the two lines never cross. Eileen, are you listening? Need your eyes to be up on the board, please. Let's look at these. These are not parallel lines because they are two lines, but they are not always the same distance apart, and they do not never touch. In fact, they do touch right here. So the lines cross, just like we said these lines do not cross. These lines do cross, and they are not always the same distance apart. They're much closer together here than they are here. So these lines are not parallel. Jasmine, can you tell me why these lines are not parallel? If you can't tell me, you need to be paying better attention, okay? Thanks. As I erase the board, we are going to take a look at some more lines and decide whether or not they are parallel. All right. So let's look at these lines first. Are these lines parallel? Vivian, what do you think? Good, I heard you say they're not parallel. You're right, they're not parallel. Can you come up to the board and show us why they are not parallel? Good, and Vivian described that they're not parallel because they cross, so they do touch, and they're not always the same distance apart. So right here, they are a smaller distance apart than they would be if we extended these lines. They would be a much larger distance apart if we extended the lines below. Good, Vivian, thanks. Let's try this one. Are these lines parallel? Jose, why are these lines parallel? Not quite. Cardell, can you help him out? Why are these lines parallel? That's right, Cardell. They're parallel because they're always the same distance apart and they never touch. All right. Stay with me, Matthew, please. Thanks. Raven, can you please come to the board and tell us whether or not these lines are parallel? And be sure to tell us why.